can. Okay, I'll put that on pause.
And then we'll go around and do introductions. I'll introduce the first question and then we'll go. Welcome to the second panel discussion for the Digital Life Collective series that seems to be emerging. This one is about tech, power, and patterns, inspired by actually the catalyst for our first panel was Douglas Rushkoff, and it was his Team Human show that led me to Jeremy's work on the patterning instinct. And some of what he said combined with some of what I've been listening to about tech and power and inclusion. And I wanted to talk, and y'all said yes. So thank you very much. We'll just go around and very quickly introduce ourselves. I'll go in the order of our screen, my screen, so everybody has a different order on the screen, but it'll be June, and then me, and then Gideon, and then.
Great. I'm June Holly, and I'm a network weaver, have been for a long time, and I'm just here to help Christina with the tech issues and gathering questions.
I'm Christina Bowen. I am a co-founding member and knowledge ecologist for the Digital Life Collective, and build system and network maps for all sorts of projects. My background is ecology, wetland ecology, and I'm interested in how information flows in organizations, how organizations are literally living systems and communities are literally living systems, and what complexity science could offer us if we were to understand that literal connection. Gideon, Jeremy, and then Joachim. Oh, Gideon, you're muted.
Every time. I'm Gideon Rosenblatt, and I'm up in Seattle, Washington. I come out of the technology sector. I was at Microsoft for about 10 years working on some of their early internet stuff. Then I spent about 10 years running an organization that was called One Northwest, later renamed Groundwire, which was basically providing technology assistance to the environmental movement. After that, I took off, and I've been mostly focused. I do some support for community groups still, but most of what I'm doing now is writing about the future of machine intelligence and how that relates to the human experience and to the future of organizations.
Okay. So I'm Jeremy Lent, and I'm the author of The Patterning Instinct, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning, that got published last year, and basically looks at the different ways in which cultures have patterned meaning into the cosmos from the earliest times, from when we were hunter-gatherers all the way to the modern age and looking out into the future. And the basic gist of the book is that our underlying core worldviews shape our values. Those values actually shape the course of history and, of course, the course of the future. And I'm also the founder of the Leology Institute, which is an institute dedicated to offering a framework for a worldview that could enable humans to thrive sustainably on the planet into the indefinite future. It's a worldview based on integration of all the different aspects of our experience.
So Joachim, and then Stephen, and then Bianca.
Thank you. My name is Joachim Stroh. If you can't pronounce that name, no worries. I have so many different versions of that. So Joachim. My role, I see my role as a change agent. My background is in computer science and knowledge management. Worked for the HR consulting industry for many years, kind of bridging the gaps between technology and what organizations can do. So learned a lot about organizational design and organizational collaboration technologies. I'm also co-founder of the Digital Life Collective, and recently involved in projects like the social ledger and the organization of the self-organization of work teams and our governance model for the collective. Thank you.
I'll go next. So I'm Stephen Green. I'm a recovering banker and economist here in Portland, Oregon. My day job is I'm the director of operations for WeWork here in Portland, where we have right now 3 buildings. In my former life, I've worked in finance, venture capital, supporting startups, mainly Black and Latino-owned startups around the country. I'm also the founder of Pitch Black, which is an event series that we do around the country that's like Shark Tank for Black entrepreneurs, where we help entrepreneurs not only build financial capital, but more importantly, they build social capital as they go and grow their ideas and their businesses and hire employees. And so I'm the son of 2 technologists. Both my parents are electrical engineers. Both of them started technology companies back in the 80s and 90s. And so I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks.
Bianca?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bianca, and my headphones broke between this morning and now, so I'm in Toronto. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I kind of have three portions of my background that are relevant. I worked in tech for about 10 years, doing operations, infrastructure, product management. At the end of it, for about 5 years, I worked as a facilitator, running public meetings, so working on public engagement, being my name is Bianca Wylie. I'm here tonight to help run this meeting. I have no vested interest in the outcome of it person, so the sort of process neutral facilitator between governments and people when they're making decisions. And then in the last 5 years, I've really been working a lot with data. I founded the Open Data Institute of Toronto, Civic Tech Toronto I co-founded, and lately I've really been working on data governance, and how the public sector is using technology and software. And recently Sidewalk Labs has launched a project in Toronto, so I've really been involved in advocacy around smart cities and how to make sure they have a democratic element to how they're constructed and implemented. So I guess the real turning point for me was I was really interested in data, and then I went in and I saw government tech systems, and then I was like, wow, I'm not as concerned about data, because understanding the state of government tech, so really procurement and things related to how governments are using technology are really focal and of interest to me. So nice to hear all about you, and I'm sorry for the background noise, and I'm really excited to have this discussion with you.
So to get us started, I would love to hear from Jeremy, whose book and thinking catalyzed this conversation. What are the most worrisome and or hopeful patterns that you see in tech, and what would be your suggestions from the point of view you have of our cognitive history as we move into this new collective cognitive space of the internet? So just if you can speak to that, that would be fantastic.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's kind of two key points I want to touch on, then we can maybe take it from there. But the first is that, when we look at the grand sweep of history, from when humans first evolved to the future, we can actually see there's just 2 or 3 times in all of human history when the human experience underwent a profound transformation, like a complete paradigm shift. You can see that when we went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to settling down and doing agriculture, basically. You see that in the scientific revolution period around the 17th century, when traditional ideas got completely changed through scientific thought, which led to the Industrial Revolution, which led to our modern world. And I think that I'm very convinced, and I think lots of people are, that we are undergoing right now, as we speak, the 3rd great transition of human history. And that transition is basically driven by this incredible exponentially rapidly shifting reality we live in through technology. And it's not just one technology, but it's the convergence of different technologies that lead to almost like double exponential growth and shift, so that we don't just look at profound transitions, but transitions that are happening at faster and faster rates that it's just dizzying to even understand. So that things things that like look like science fiction suddenly become happening, and then within a very short period of time, they just become common sense norms, and then we move on to that next kind of phase transition. So that's one thing, is that we are transitioning to a fundamentally different reality for human beings, which is kind of terrifying and incredibly exciting at the same time. And within that, I think it's just as important to look at the context of this transition, because we live in a society that is consuming the earth at a faster and faster pace, partly driven by our amazing technological power that humans now have over the rest of the natural world we didn't have before, partly driven by the economic and cultural context of this shift, which is this global capitalist society that is actually based on growing more and more economic value in terms of financial dollars and shareholder value, through consuming natural resources as fast as possible and growing it as fast as possible, and through turning human activity into monetary resource. So for this kind of global economic system, regular human activity that doesn't increase GDP or doesn't increase shareholder value for a big corporation is meaningless. And so a lot of that power is used to translate human activity into essentially turning us into automata, if you will, for maximizing shareholder value along with natural resources. So we have this context of our global cultural economic value system, and we have this amazing shift in technology. And I think one of the scariest things is that when you put those two together, it can lead to outcomes that can be devastating for core human values and for the natural world. The question is, how can those two drives be somehow disentangled so that this amazing power of technology can actually be used for our human quality and for essentially offering it like a more sustainable and flourishing way of humans to relate with the natural world, rather than essentially destroy it for the basis of increasing this global shareholder value. So that's just to sort of kick off what I see as the key issues.
Can we hear from all the panelists on that question? Gideon, and then Bianca and Stephen.
So I'll jump in, maybe starting with something relatively abstract and then make it more concrete. I think so. First of all, Jeremy's book is an excellent read for those of you who haven't read it. It's The Patterning Instinct, and I highly recommend it. Yes, I have it too right here. What I find when I look at this problem from the really big picture, I see it in terms of the expansion of intelligence on the planet. And if you go way back, you can kind of see that at each stage you have, like from a systems perspective, you have these elements that somehow come together through better communication. Whether it's individual organisms coming together into multicellular organisms, moving up into more and more sophisticated, some of those individual cells coming together into forming actual brains that then kind of shift us into a different mode of reality, kind of a mental reality, that then enables individual organisms to then come together into social clusters. That then kind of evolves into human culture. And so at each level, there's these individual parts that are kind of communicating with each other and wrapped by something bigger that allows them to coordinate. The problem that I see right now is that that thing that has enabled us humans to coordinate better and to synchronize ourselves into kind of a synthetic intelligence, like a synthesis of our shared intelligence, started off as kind of simple organizations, but over time it has been monetized. It's become a financial instrument. It's actually capital. And the problem right now is that it is now owned, right? That shell that is the thing around which we collaborate, around which our intelligence comes together into something bigger than just us individually, is owned by shareholders. And it's I think it's no accident that I think that's the kind of the single most powerful mechanism for control today is this thing that Jeremy referred to, which is shareholder primacy, right? This idea that those organizations are run for one purpose, and that is maximizing returns for their shareholders. So that, I think, is kind of the root of a lot of these problems that then kind of spill out as a result of that. I'll stop there and see if other people have some things to add.
I think my instinct right now is that this is the opportunity for the state to reassert itself. Like this for me is, given everything you're saying, this is the time where humans have agency. We make technology, we make laws. So I think what is the counter to the issue that you're discussing in terms of where a lot of the challenges are coming from, is designed by people as our laws, and as is the state, and as is our governance. And it's a hard time to defend the state, given, you know, the state of the state and the state of, engagement with the state. But I don't think that the third way, this is a hard one, because when I think about things like welfare, poverty reduction, whatever else, I'm also very much right now thinking, how do communities start to come together to resolve some of these things, because state programs are not working. I can say in Toronto, 25% of the kids here are hungry, and this is one of these high-functioning OECD, democratic places. So I don't think it's all about the state, but I think in terms of an immediate reaction to how to manage some of these issues, it is the state. And so I think this is this kind of challenge right now is, do we want to go there, and do we want to reinvigorate our participation with our laws so that we govern these things and regulate these things? Or do we want to slide into the libertarian tendencies that I think technology, enable, which is where I get really concerned, because I've been talking to people who only know, who are 19, 20 years old. And when I say, how do you feel about Uber coming into the city and driving over the governance mechanisms, and getting quite upset about it, and having a teacher kind of tell me, like, no one here cares. That's all that people here know. So the consumer experience is starting to supplant the resident experience, right? And so that's where this blurriness for me is quite an urgent challenge. But that's my initial response to the stuff that you surfaced so far. And I'm still trying. My back's against the wall sometimes when I realize I'm arguing for state surveillance over corporate surveillance. But you know what? I'm like, that's the one I'm going to go with right now in terms of how to get out of this stuff.
If I could just kind of riff off one point you're saying, Bianca. One thing I think is valuable, and it's something that I really picked up a lot from Kate Rayworth's great book, Donut Economics, which kind of re-establishes ways of looking at economy in general, is a sense that, in addition to what you said, and I agree completely, that the state versus sort of private enterprise, whatever, there are these other two domains of economy that got sort of disappeared in modern cultural discourse, which has to do with the commons. And the commons is a really, really powerful dimension of economic activity. And then the household. And we can think of household as actually being community, just people working in community together. So I find that to be helpful, because then it also moves on from the sort of old 20th century political paradigmatic, like, oh, it's capitalism versus communism, free enterprise versus state, but it totally reestablishes a way of thinking about economic activity that I think is helpful.
Yeah, just quickly before I forget it, I think the reason I love those ideas, and I love them as a medium term, I just think people's capacity is so scraped right now that we're in survive mode, in which case the capacity of this state to start to generate space for that work is critical. And I think that's where we can immediately have something happening, because I love all those ideas. But when I looked at people's capacity to engage and to welcome people in and to be uncomfortable and to be irritated by neighbors and have to deal with all of this, is not where we're at, because we're so pushed against the wall with the state of capitalism right now. So I find I'm completely with you. And I think it's a staggered thing, maybe is the way out of it. But yeah, completely.
Stephen?
So I guess I'll come at this from a little different angle. Here in the United States right now, we've got more people living in the closest proximity to one another than they ever have in U.S. history. Another fact is Americans spend the least amount of time with their next door neighbors than they have since the 1930s. And so I find it fascinating that the erosion of the civic commons is happening at a time where we've lived in closest proximity that we've ever had. That being said, I think where we need to start when it comes to technology is even just the classes that we create with the nomenclature that we use. And the example I'll take is, I think about technology as a tool. It's not a silo, it's not its own vertical. If you want to scale any kind of business, I own a brew pub with some friends. We have a mobile app that tracks our kegs so that we know where they're at, right? We are not a technology business at all, but we do understand a business with 12 people needs to be able to leverage the tool of technology in order to scale and do things. What I'm scared of what's happening right now is that we've created a class system of people that see themselves in tech or don't see themselves in tech, and that's it. And people that see themselves in tech, they feel like they get the ability to chime in. The folks on the outside are outsiders, and they don't get to, be part of that process. What is heartening to me is that technology and other tools are more available, cheaper today than they ever have been. And we have people, regardless of their class or their race or their education, able to leverage those tools. So case in point, you mentioned talking about car share, what's going on with Lyft and Uber. That was something started by folks who had, great college credentials. There's a company here in Portland that's raised over $3 million, started by a gentleman who was homeless 10 years ago, like literally living in a homeless shelter. And he started a technology company because of the tools that were available that helps people that are homeless find access to housing very, very quickly. He's raised millions of dollars. He did not go to Stanford. He did not, grow up in Silicon Valley. And what I'm excited about is we have people getting into technology now that don't have the pedigree, but they definitely have the talent. I think about how can we bring tools of technology to different communities. One key community that I think is the most innovative community we have in the country is people in prisons. There's no more innovative people than the people that are sitting in prisons who have time on their hands and are always seemingly finding ways to do so much with so little. And so what my hope is that technology and the tool will continue to spread to more communities, and we can do that faster. The other thing from a capitalism standpoint is I love that younger generations, they're driven by purpose and autonomy, and it's not the highest and best returns to the shareholder. And we're seeing the emergence and growth of what it means to be a public benefit corporation, and how more and more companies are doing that. And a lot of it is being driven by the fact that if they want to hire 20, 30, 40-year-olds into your company, you have to be a purpose-driven company, particularly in a place like Portland, where that's just kind of, the starting point. My friends and I, we have a nonprofit brew pub. We donate all of the profits to charity, right? Like that's a very Portland-esque thing. But I think if you want to get top-notch talent, you have to be able to do more than provide, what's on the bottom line. So,
I just wanted to add one more piece because I haven't heard any of you talking about, and that is like the capacity to self-organize that is starting to emerge everywhere, and the interface with technology. There's so many technology needs that we have to have, but ordinary people in communities, maybe it's not their neighbor, but they're finding somebody to do some small thing with in their community, communicate with other people who are trying things out, and really starting to muck around and understand the problems they're trying to solve or the new worldview they're trying to help create. And so I would love to put that in the mix and hear some of you talk a little bit about that, and how it's just been such a struggle to try to, like, right now, there is not a platform that helps people, like, say, hey, I want to do this, helps them find people who want to collaborate with them, who then actually supports their action, helps them really learn. And then really importantly, how do you lift out like what's been learned and share it really broadly? So I'd love to hear people's thoughts about, how are we going to get the tech we need to really make self-organizing take off? But it is a very hopeful sign, because it's just exploding everywhere. I've been kind of out there trying to, find out about it, and just, it's just happening at such a accelerating at such a rapid pace that, I think if it's not on your radar now, it will be soon.
June, that leads us, let me just frame that a little bit. That leads us to our next question perfectly, which is, what are simple ways that normal people can change their behavior online to gain more control over their digital presence? And I'd love to hear sort of concrete right now, because of course the possible futures that could be imagined with the brains that I'm looking at the moment, and hearts, not to be dualistic, are amazing. But I would love to hear that, like, concrete things individuals could do to self-organize, to actually gain more agency and control over their digital selves. Anybody want to start us off there?
I mean, I guess I can start off with a little bit of a, like, it kind of is more a response to June's point, is that I, having seen that energy and enthusiasm, actually find it problematic, because I find people are getting all excited and enthusiastic and accepting structural constraints around funding for housing and for food and for things that are never going to be resolved online with tools. I mean, they're there, but I think the problem is we're twiddling at the edges with tech instead of going to the core functions. And, like, sometimes people right now could be going to meetings of other communities if they were even welcome, and just taking notes would be helpful. Like, you want to talk about, Stephen, tools. It's like, sometimes it's not even, a technology layer tool. It's like helping people keep track of stuff, administrative stuff, helping people access services, right? Like, as humans. So I guess I'm more bearish on this, if I'm going to borrow some Wall Street talk here. Like, I'm not super bullish on all this, because I've seen it for years, and it's great intentions, and it turns into hobbyists for the most part, from what I've seen, and I've been part of that. So, like, I find that enthusiasm is like, wow, you got that energy, go get political, like old school with that energy. I think that's more important right now. But that's why I think, like, what can people be doing online? Maybe they can be learning how to better organize offline, right? Like, I think that's how do you teach and, get out into reality with how you're connected online, and that's, I don't know. I feel like we need to be around each other more in real life. So I'm struggling a bit with the question, and that's sort of like, June, that's kind of where I come from with that one. But I'm also not super seasoned on organizing online. So I may have a different, like, I'm very aware that I come from my little, with that's my little lens and experience. And it doesn't mean that there aren't many other perspectives and useful ways to be doing this stuff online. So I'll toss that back out.
Thanks, Bianca. That's really challenging and exciting for all of us. I mean, if you look at this, technology has been progressing at increasingly rapid, pace. We've seen that. We know this. Jeremy has said that in his book. But humans, not so much, right? We're kind of lagging behind here a bit. We're still trained, educated in 19th century, mindsets, right? We're becoming customers, as you mentioned earlier, Bianca. We're becoming, a consumer society, products that churn out cat gifts and selfies, right? So what we need to do is sort of reflect a bit on, hey, let's do something for the human side. Let's go and develop our skill sets here so it begins to match the potentials we have in these online and network environments, right? it has a lot to do with sort of adult development theory. It comes up here. Here's a good book. I don't know if you've seen that, In Everyone Culture, that talks about, you know, building organizations from the ground up that are based on human qualities, right? How do you reach out to other people? How do you connect? How do you get and build these skill sets inside organizations that are not just about the top-down stuff that we had all of the time, right? From formulating ideas and executing the stuff that's coming from the top, but more so from engaging with people on a much lower level and finding where the good ideas sit inside the organization and how can we bring them up and make people understand, right? Create sort of a level sense-making field that all lifts everybody up in the organization, right? And then helps us to move forward. And then connecting to what June said, you know, find new governance models really inside these organizations, you know, self-organization in organizations that we can slowly introduce. And there are a few models out there. You hear from holacracy, you hear from, you know, sociocracy, still to me fairly strict, you know, very stringent, constrained models. But I think we're just at the beginning to find new governance models in this decentralized world and that we're diving in now, right? That's my thinking. Yeah.
And yeah, if I can, follow on from this kind of line of thinking, yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's great to have this theme of self-organization, of ideas and community come into our conversation, but where I see one of the biggest issues is the whole fact that once again we're in this context of this global capitalist society. So if somebody comes up with this great self-organized idea, hey, we've got this new technology that allows better ways for community to get together to do this or that, whether it's drive a car or get together on media and share community. What happens is, say you have these two different groups that have this good idea. One wants to stay self-organized, wants to make sure it's for the benefit of people, and they just want to kind of grow in this natural way. And then you have this other group that looks for venture capital funding. We've got this better mousetrap. It's so great. Somebody put, okay, we'll give you $100 million if you can prove your concept. We can easily raise $1 billion. And because of the scale effects of the internet that we're all familiar with, that $1 billion funded organization ends up being the next Facebook or Uber or whatever. And the one that actually wants to be there for the benefit of humanity sort of gets peripheral. So I think one of the key questions, I'm not the technologist, but I think, Gideon, I think that I've heard you share some ideas you've come across on this, is how do you actually use the technology to subvert this global capitalist centralized finance-driven system? So when you get some self-organized idea emerging that could really work for humanity, that can work for a flourishing environment, that can work ecologically, rather than just growth-driven and profit-driven for shareholders, how does that actually end up budding out that growth, finance, scale effect capitalist model that we've seen have been so effective the last decade or two?
So I'll jump in there because this is something I do think about a lot. So the interesting thing about these two models, let's call one kind of the typical capitalist model and the other more of a commons type model, is the first one kind of eats itself up by extracting all of this money in terms of dividends and share buybacks. It basically, I mean, that's the mechanism through which the wealth is extracted from these organisms. I mean, these organizations. It's not like some abstract thing. This is, I mean, it's trillions of dollars. It's actually, I went back and looked at what the Federal Reserve tracks in this stuff. It's about 5% of our GDP every year gets pulled out. I mean, that's a lot of money. And so, and when you look at it from a corporate perspective, what's happening is that all these profits are being sucked out of these companies rather than being invested back in. Then you look at something like, say, an REI, right, which is an example of a very successful kind of more commons-driven. It's a consumer cooperative, right? They're very well run. They're able, so all of that money that would otherwise be spilling out of the company is being plowed back in. It's either being plowed back into the customers in terms of dividends, or it's being plowed back into their IT systems and their training and all that kind of stuff. So once those companies are up and running, they're actually way more sustainable. But the problem is, and this is the thing you're talking about, Jeremy, is how do you get them up and running? Because it takes a lot of money to reach scale like that. And I know that there are lots of examples of smaller types of entities that don't, where scale doesn't really matter. But we are moving into a world where, giants are they're eating, the software is eating the world, right? They're consuming you. You have an Amazon that's now like 4% of total retail, right? So they are kind of, through their scale, they're eating up these smaller operatives. So I think the most interesting thing for me right now are all these experiments that are happening around ownership and changing the way that we think about ownership. I'll close these comments with one example, which is there's an organization that's based on the Ethereum stack that's called Colony, and they are doing some really interesting stuff to kind of build. They're basically building a platform for co-ops, really. And if you look at the way that they're organizing themselves, they're really rethinking some of the fundamental principles about what ownership even is, and what does it mean to gain ownership in something. And their model is more about you actually work, you participate in the enterprise, and through that you gain equity. Now you can also you can invest up front too. So they're not, they recognize that there's a need for financing too. But they're kind of treating these models in some new ways that I find very exciting, and I think that's the way out of this. But it's not a short-term fix. It's a longer-term thing. But I think the more that we can get this younger generation interested in those models and prioritizing those models, I think that's part of our path out.
The other thing that I'll add to this, part of it is a perspective piece, and also just democratization of technology and these tools. I think generalization here, by and large, someone who's grown up middle, upper class, going to a great school is not thinking about as their dissertation at Stanford, how am I going to get homeless people into affordable housing, right? It's probably going to be someone who's had that lived experience. And so how do we broaden the path for access to technology and these tools for folks? Because I think if we broaden that and we get less homogeneous about who gets access to technology, venture capital, we're going to see the natural these other things manifest themselves. I love the fact that now in the United States, crowdfunding is actually a bigger dollar amount of money invested in companies than venture capital is. Venture capital still gets all the articles, right? But when it comes to the money that's actually going to firms, you're better off going with one of the 600 platforms that exist than going the venture capital route. And I do like that people can get access to that, whether they're in Portland or Silicon Valley or Wenatchee or wherever they're at. I think part of this is just understanding how we've gotten to this point, is that there's been a pretty myopic group of individuals who've been able to have access to scaling companies, scaling their ideas. It's not that the other folks didn't exist. They just, by and large, didn't have access to the social capital that would allow them to get to the financial capital to do that. And now technology is allowing these other folks to be entrants into this. And so how do we proactively make sure that not only people at MIT and Stanford get access to the most innovative stuff, the newest research, but also people in rural parts of Western Washington and Texas and the inner cities, because we have the ability to do that through technology now, and making that a priority as opposed to a nice to have or something that we sprinkle on top. Harvard recently talked about some research that they did on a longitudinal study that talked about the companies that return the highest amount of money to shareholders in industries are the ones that have the most diverse teams, right? So we talk about companies here in Portland doing a tech pledge where they do more diversity. Well, if people were capitalistic pigs, they would have women and people of color not only working in the company, but in leadership. But we don't have that, right? And so what ends up happening is the tribal nature of human beings and the pattern matching. But if we really did focus on what did grow companies, we would actually have women and people of color in those positions, because the research shows that. So we're not doing what makes us money, so we're leaving money on the table, and we're also not doing the moral imperative. And what we're left with is what people are comfortable with, pattern matching. And so how do we disrupt that and know that that's our natural inclination? And I think that starts with calling that out first, and then making sure these tools are available much more broadly, because then I think we're going to see a much more broader set of ideas and how businesses are structured, because now we're bringing other cultures and communities into the fold.
But there's a lot, the missing piece is like this need for these massive learning networks. So there's lots of things that balls that have got to shift in this. So people learning what you're talking about, Stephen, there's a lot to learn about not only doing a business or a thing, but scaling it. How do you help it go viral? So lots of innovations are happening that I see all over, but it's like there's not enough excess capacity to say, okay, let's get people together from 6 rural and inner city communities and help them all learn about this, and then we can keep learning together over the next years until we begin to figure some of this stuff out. And so, and I see this happening, oh boy, and wonderful communities of color, communities of women who are doing fabulous learning communities that are really starting to make a difference in certain places. But, I don't see part of it is where's the resources going to come and the skill to run these kinds of learning communities so that this stuff can really spread rapidly and people can get the help for all the challenges that they're meeting. And in the process, they're also changing their own culture. They're changing the way they're learning how to interact as peers, how to let go of control, how to engage and embrace diversity. And so I feel like that's a key missing piece, and wondering if people have thoughts about that and about how, where the resources can come for something.
But that's also perspective, June. So I think when someone is trying to be innovative in a community, they're not thinking about scale. They're thinking about, I see people in my neighborhood that don't have housing. They're not thinking about how can I spread this to other places around the world. And so I think oftentimes when I talk to founders of companies that have not scaled into other markets or gone to Belize or wherever they could be going, that's just not even in their mind, because they saw a problem, they attacked it, it's solved, and now it's on to the next thing. So what would it look like to create an environment where you had people like yourself finding about these great ideas that happen in Portland, and then someone saying, all right, I'm going to help you figure out the next 20 cities. Wow, I didn't even know I could do that. And so that's a lot of what happens with, especially people that are disconnected from historic frameworks of scaling companies, is they have a great brand or idea or scalable thing. It's just they attacked the problem got solved, and now they're on to the next thing. And they never even thought about scale and what that means.
So I know we have 10 minutes left. I know that Jeremy has to leave. Anybody else who has a hard stop, we'll make space for you to leave then too. We do have half an hour afterwards, and I know that there's few enough attendees, we can probably open it up. I certainly would love to hear Danielle, who's in the chat here, on some of these points. I heard the concrete things people can do is vote, get engaged in politics, engage your community in a healthy way, even if that means low tech taking notes to support good community action. Pay attention to who owns what and what you can shift about that in your community, and understand and shift tribal patterns. And because we're going to lose Jeremy in 10 minutes, I would love to hear about pattern shifting and money flows and ownership, and what you think would be the most effective there.
Yeah. So in terms of pattern shifting and like in relation to money flows and ownership, I think that the most important thing is to recognize the stranglehold that these gigantic transnational corporations have over the way that we being all of humanity at this point, the way we think, the way we make decisions, our options, just the very things that are available to us day to day. And, you know, some of the things that are hard to sort of get your head around, but if you look at the top 100 economies of the world, 69 of those top 100 are transnational corporations. So they actually are far more powerful than even any individual countries, never mind the rest of sort of human community or whatever. And so I do think that it's really critical to try to sort of shift the dialogue a little bit, and to start having our political discussions that, you know, in mainstream conversation about what can we do to actually undo some of those strangleholds. And the ideas are there. In fact, I recently put out an article on like sort of 5 ways that without actually sort of changing the fundamental structure of our global capitalist economy, which is a whole other thing that we need to do at some point. But even within that structure, there are things we can do. And Stephen, I think you mentioned earlier the notion of benefit corporations, or it may have been Gideon. And there's these ideas already out there that companies can choose to be like a benefit corporation or a B Corp, with basically a triple bottom line. Meaning that the actual corporation has in its charter that it's not just about making profits, but also people and planet. So community and its relations to the environment become equal bottom lines along with making profit. Now, right now, even you have some sort of high quality corporations that might have a CEO heading it who's got a conscience and sees what's going on, who actually wants to do these good things. But when they do that, they are actually at risk of shareholder lawsuits, because the whole structure of our global economy says, no, you can't do that. So like probably in my view, maybe the single most effective tweak in the system that would have this dramatic effect is if it actually got established that corporations are only past a certain size, say 100 million in revenues, whatever it might be, can only be allowed to have their charters if they actually legally put down in the charter to have that triple bottom line. And maybe that they need to get those charters recertified every 5 years. So it becomes a really meaningful shift. So you still have corporations, you still have this global capitalist system, but suddenly they would be thinking about things in very different ways, because all of these elements that we see that could be positive could be shifted towards actually being there for humans and for the environment too. So that's just an example of one tweak that can have this massive follow-on effect. So I'll just open up if any other people have.
I think it's also important to understand the difference between, always making profit maximization the priority versus building and growing a brand. And I think a great historic example is what happened with Tylenol in the early 80s, where the people in Chicago, I believe it was, about 10 people died from taking Tylenol. And at that point in time, we didn't have recall system. There wasn't the FDA doing that. And Johnson & Johnson made the decision and lost tens of millions of dollars by pulling Tylenol off the shelf. And what it came down to was they had a value of do no harm. and they saw what was happening, and so they pulled it. And so, you know, as much as I know profit maximization always comes up, we do have really good examples of companies going and saying, hey, in the long term, for us to build profits, we have to continue this brand, and this is what this brand stands for. And so I would love to see, you know, more examples of how companies have done that and still emerged, you know, from tough decisions in a good spot. But you have to be willing to take those risks and make tough calls. It's not just, you know, well, we're a B Corp, so we're good. I think we're doing the triple bottom line. Because if we're honest with a lot of the B Corps, they do the environmental stuff, but they're not necessarily doing the people stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I'd like to respond while Jeremy's still here. I suppose, you know, me and my one-trick pony here of government is that I feel like we're creating a lot of complexity instead of using the system we have. So I'm always going to be someone who goes back and says, okay, why aren't we just making sure that we're funding our infrastructure properly? Why aren't we funding our housing properly? Why aren't we funding, you know, why aren't we changing the tax rates to, you know, why? So I don't like holding the constraints we have as fixed and then, you know, doing all this other stuff on the side when there's a very straightforward path to try first, at least. And maybe this is not to say it's an A or B, maybe it's a concurrent thing. I just hear from a lot of this, like I agree with a lot of it, but I also think, like, let's not throw that thing away yet before we've pushed it. And I think that's like, there's only so much, you know, you can accomplish with that social good thing. I actually don't like creating this confusion within corporations. Like, I like it when I know what they're doing. And then I like it because then I know how to set rules for what might be done. And I know that race is hard. And with tech, we've particularly seen it as being really, really challenging for governments to regulate. But in some of the recent conversations I've been in around data and technology, they said, let's stop trying to manage the 100 different things that may be out there with our data or with how it might be used, and start to think about the usages of data in terms of regulating the usage. What are the companies that are coming out? What are they doing? How do we feel about those things? And, you know, how should we create guardrails for them? So I just don't want us to leave the thing we got behind and launch into all this other stuff when we haven't, you know, pushed this thing. And maybe, again, this may be a difference between Canada and America, right? Like, I may be saying something and you're thinking, and I know the course of history isn't always on the side here of mine to say, because like, look where we are right now. I just would also like to push that mechanism and understand it is an innovation unto itself, and it can evolve as well. And at the end of the day, that housing and the, you know, these infrastructure pieces we need, they need to be funded. They will not be created out of an innovation, right? They're capital infrastructure pieces. And June, I think just to close on the point you made, education, like they are tripping over themselves to figure out how to evolve. Sharing stories between cities, that's what mayors networks do. I mean, this stuff is there already. We have systems and organizations that share. And we have capacity building things that are state funded, right? So I think I very much want to say everything that I'm hearing I agree with, but I also think it's an and, right? And like, I just don't want us to leave that point. So I'm always going to stick my hand up and say, yeah, but let's just try to raise tax rates to build the housing, because we can't, even if we get good at matching people. I know in Canada, you can match everybody. We still don't have enough housing. That's a core problem here. So that's how I see those things together. It's got to be all complementary function, and using government funding to fund the commons kind of governance and the things. Because I always think too, all these models sound great. Who's got the time? How do you take care of the person who can't participate at all in those systems, right? That's kind of that's the rights lens as well. So how does that intersect with all of this? So it's all in there. I just think it's all like, how much energy, I hate to think that super progressive people aren't using their power on the old stuff. So how do we make sure we're also doing it on both?
I know it's 11, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I want to give you a
So I
chance
have
to say goodbye. Anybody else, let me know.
Just want to thank you all for incredibly rich conversation, and I'll look forward to following up afterwards on the Q&A that came after I've had to jump off now. But thank you, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
And anybody who can stay, we do have another 30 minutes. Bianca, I want to push back a little bit on what you just said, because I do think that there's a difference between working on the system that we have and making it better and rebuilding the system entirely. I do think that in human history, because we're at this transition point right now, the only way we've ever had to organize at scale is hierarchy. That has worked well for a reason. And most of our structures in nonprofits, in for-profits, and government systems are hierarchical systems. If we're going to self-organize, we suddenly have this external networked brain around the world that maybe we could do that with if we could figure out how to use it. So the importance of learning and self-organizing, and yes, taking notes at a local place really resonates with me, because you want to support that. But we have the potential to learn in a way that we have never done before. And so, and that is tech facilitated, although I agree with all of the how tech is built problems. So.
Yeah, one other thing I think that is important to mention here too is that so as much as I am one of these believers in the biggest lever being the attacking the shareholder primacy problem, I don't think that we can do that and ignore the problem of what that problem has done to government, at least in the United States, which is that because of the kind of the flow of money into politics, at least on a federal level, I think most people in the U.S. Have kind of given up on Congress, certainly, and even at the state level, it's starting to kind of seems to creep down into that too. Where there does seem to be some hope is at the municipal level. Like I'm actually pretty bullish on, you know, the innovation and all the great stuff that's happening in cities across the United States. But I think the Trump phenomena is, you know, when he said the system is rigged, you know, his skill is being able to find some element of truth out there and then distort it, right? He takes that sense that we all have that the system is rigged, and then he spins it to his, you know, to whatever kind of distorted view he has. But so that's the thing that I keep coming back to is like, these things they're interlaced as these companies, these giant companies make more and more profit, then they basically siphon in some of that profit into the structures of government to make sure that the rules kind of support their ability to make more profit. So I think we got to tackle this on kind of a two-pronged front. But one of it is definitely, you know, it's targeting things like money in politics, but also things like gerrymandering. And I mean, there are some core democratic reforms that I think we also need to tackle.
Bianca, I don't know about how it is in Toronto, but here in Oregon and in Portland, definitively, on the public sector side, 55% of our public employees are eligible to retire in the next 5 years. Meanwhile, the median age in the city of Portland is 34. And so the people that we have making decisions and you know, making, you know, forcing rules and doing those things do not match up with the people that we have living in the city. And as someone who worked for the city for 7 years myself, it was a very uphill battle in really talking about innovation and having, there was no urgency. And what I'm hopeful for in the Trump phenomenon is the emergence of people in the last 2 years who have dropped what they were doing in the private sector and said, I'm going to go work at the city. And they're bringing this new lens on things that is all around engagement. I think outreach is a dirty word. There's nothing in our lives that we like doing that we call outreach. We do not outreach to our grandma, our girlfriend. The only people I've ever seen use outreach are people and public officials that work for the city. And I think that's a dirty word. It's something you do to someone, not with someone. And so I think I love that we have people setting aside great jobs at Nike that pay more to go and be part of the city. But I also see the angst that we have here in that we have a lot of people that are within 5 years of retirement. They're coasting downhill. And when we say things like innovation and inclusion, they hear man, I miss the good old days. And unfortunately, the good old days were good for a couple people, but generally not good for the current population of the people that we have here in the city today. And so, how do we create that civic commons and connection and trust building that needs to emerge so that the ideas and the innovation can actually happen? Because what we have right now, at least in Oregon, is people that are just done. They don't want to connect with people in the public sector at all. And there's just no trust. And without that trust, you can't have good ideas bubble up to the top or collaborations that I know could really happen. And so if you've got ideas around that, I know we're trying to do like an advisory committee here made up of people from the private sector to support the mayor's office and city council. But all that stuff starts with trust and an idea that, I think if we come together, they'll take it to the finish line. There's just not that trust yet.
Yeah, so much yes to what you're saying, and I think this is why it comes back when I see we're having a municipal election in Toronto soon, and you see the people running that look like the city, and and this is where we got to get behind people, and we got to get leadership. We need racialized people that are running to have support and to have white people put their money and their support behind people that are going to be representative in terms of bringing energy and leadership and power. Because this is the thing, that public service is this great thing, but without political will, it's going to do a lot of the things that you're saying, and this is the problem. Like I saw this, I've seen this at all levels of our government. Amazing people in the public service want to do great things, but they don't have a political leader who's forcing that change. So I think that for me goes right back to the candidates that are running and supporting, getting that fresh leadership in. It's hard. Like I'm not saying it's hard. And what can we do in the interim? I think finding ways to get those, who are the side of the desk people who are sticking their neck out and, trying to do something, even if it's not necessarily going to end well for them. That's been this nice opportunity where I've seen some of these communities kind of come in and meet public servants halfway, but I don't like it to be somewhat not formally someone's job to do that. So I find it super precarious right now. But yeah, I think for me, it goes back to who's running, how do we support them, and how do we enable that kind of leadership to rise? I love what you said about the cities. I see the same thing, right? But I also think when Gideon, when you mentioned Trump, what I see when this is such a loaded topic, but anytime I see people being negative around, there's such a Toronto moment. How Steve Bannon was rejected or was disinvited from that New Yorker thing? Then Toronto is, oh no, hold my beer. Let us have a debate. So we've got David Frum and Steve Bannon having a debate in Toronto. After that happened, having a conversation about populism. And I'm saying, wow, right? This man is a white nationalist. We have problems with the institutions here who are creating space and oxygen for this kind of, awful, framing of things rather than the discussions that we need to have. The point I was going to make, though, is that with Trump, when I read about the state of life in America, when I read about the opioid crisis, which we all are also experiencing here, when I read about lives where it's just there's nothing there, how would you not want someone to burn it all down for you? How this is where we are just failing everyone, right? So there's all these different phenomenons, but I think that brings me back to of course people are at this point. The quality of life that we've accepted for people. I feel we're all complicit in that. But the last thing I'll say on that is that liberal democracies are built on the collective. They're built on averaging. They're built on risk pooling. They're built on saying I will take care of some people and knowing that they can't contribute my amount. And so I'm scared of losing that when we move into some of these other future models too, where it's a lot more about the, the self-sufficiency piece and how you're supposed to contribute as part of something. So it always goes back to me, some people can never work. They can never work. It doesn't mean they shouldn't have a good quality of life. How do we not lose that? That whole piece of this discussion around the economy and innovation, right? I think that's so. Those were all thoughts that were prompted by everybody talking, and I'm not sure where they all go, but I am going to go back to support good people who are running for office at all levels, and I feel good about cities. That's my let's go there. That's my happy place right now. And I completely agree that we have to talk about this conflict of the corporations and the government, because what I'm seeing now is that they are terrified of hurting business. So as much as I want the state to be the state is also terrified of doing anything that might have a negative impact on economic development. So I would be totally, remiss to pretend that's not a huge problem. So I totally agree with you about that too. That's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, go for it, Bianca. I just want to leave the political arena a bit on the side and start wondering what we can do in the here and now, right? In our engagement, even in the Digital Life Collective, right? So we have a motto, right? We want to help people. We want to understand what the technology is that's out there and engage them in different ways. And Gideon, you've been doing tremendous work in these online communities, right? John Calden, established this whole meta-level conversation there, and Michael Linton, who's also on the call here, trying to establish community currencies, right? What can we make to instill flows inside the ways we're coordinating and working together, right? Or Trevor Schultz here in New York City at the New School, doing a lot of good work on platform cooperativism, right? So there are lots of new platforms coming up, and I'm wondering here, what can we do here, really, right? Can we work on new models, right? Or should we start to fight the existing reality, right? And I know who has an answer to that, which path you should take, right? So what is it that we can do to sort of build these new models and move us forward, connect us better, right? That's something what we do in the Digital Life Collective is reach out to other collectives, right? See if they're like-minded, see if they can align, and then build a larger force that gains a bigger voice, and then move back into the arena, and then also get back into the political arena, right? Into the cities, and see what voices do we have outside there, right?
We could talk for another 3 hours, I bet, without getting too tired, as long as we had a break
Right.
for eating. But we are 15 minutes. We do have 6 questions in the Q&A from attendees. And I know we're not even going to be able to probably thoroughly answer one in the time we have left. So on the link on our website, I will make sure that in the discussion forum that those questions are there, and all of you have the chance and the links to respond to each one as you see, if you want to continue that discussion there. Danielle, who runs the Code for Science and Society in Portland, asked about the currency flow, currently very big in blockchain, that are seeming, from some points of view, just to enrich folks who are already enriched by today's financial systems. So decentralizing currency, but not actually decentralizing power. So I would love to speak to that if you're interested in that, or can all of you see the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen? So you can also jump in on any question there that you're interested in.
So I'll jump in just really with just a quick comment on that. So what is equity? What is ownership? How do we get it? The kind of the view that is at the basis of our economic system is that it's money. You basically take financial instruments, and when you pour those into an organization, you get some ownership stake. But I think some of the stuff that I find most interesting right now is you earn your stake. By contributing to an entity, you get a piece of the pie, and that is a very different. That's a very different framework, right? Because what that says is, you could have somebody who has a ton of money and very little time, and they can buy up all kinds of enterprises, right? But if you also make space so that people who don't have a lot of money, financial instruments, but they do have time, and they can earn equity by investing that time in contributing to these platforms, that's way more open, right? That just has an inherent effect of opening up the field and creating more financial liberty, right? Just by shifting the way that we think about what a contribution of equity is. I'll start with that.
As someone who's worked in investment banking and venture capital for almost 20 years, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is multi-generational wealth is a very real thing. And when you take a look at where we're at with the haves and have-nots, particularly for the Black or Latino community in the United States. We're 254 years behind when it comes to wealth creation for the Black community. And so it's hard to have an on-point discussion around finance without understanding that bigger narrative, and that really whatever conversation we're having, and I'm going to generalize here, the Gideons of the world are standing on third base, rounding home, and Steven is trying to get into the ballpark, right? And that's generally the starting point when we think about that. The biggest thing from a business structure standpoint, growth is the number 3 killer of businesses. Access to capital is the number 5 killer of businesses. I know it's easy to say, well, if I just pour more money into it, we'll grow. That's not actually how the businesses work. And so social capital, being able to know the questions to ask as you scale an idea, who I should partner with. I would love to see, I think the real way that you go and get equity and help people build and scale things is you actually look at who their network is and who their network is not. Because a lot of people that start companies, they went to Stanford, and in that amazing alumni group, they got people they can just call, and then they have an outpost in Boston and wherever. But for someone who maybe just got out of jail and has an amazing idea and is uber talented, they don't have the ability to do that, and that's what holds them back. And them getting a check later on doesn't actually solve that problem. And so what I think about when it comes to equity and kind of narrowing that gap is one, understanding the gravity of the situation. Multi-generational wealth is not going to be surpassed in one app or one thing, or any short-term thing. Have that perspective, know it exists, know it's not your fault, but know we all benefit from it in some way, shape, or form. And then understand that people need social capital. If you've got an idea, it grows because of the social capital you have, not because someone writes you a check, by and large. And so I think that's our energy and time into understanding those realities from a business standpoint.
I have to leave, and I just want to leave on that point. Thank you. What a such a critical point, because that gets skipped over so many times. So I just want to say that that's a great closing point for me to leave on and to think on. So thank you, Stephen. That's yes. I will now thank the rest of you and everybody else. Thank you for inviting me to do this. This was really fun. And I'll follow up online, and I'm really grateful to think with you all. So thank you for having me. Bye.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Do we want to just take some from the audience and perhaps just open up the mic for folks to, ask fresh questions?
Yeah, if you don't want to become a panelist, put something in the chat. Otherwise, I will add people who are still in attendee mode, and we can hear a few questions voice. Cameron, I know you had one, so adding you now. And I'm not seeing any, I don't want to be in here.
A couple people did leave. You should have said it was fine to still lurk, but.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have among the participants here, even the people on the panelists, do you have a question?
Cameron is putting his question, so I'll speak for him. The UBI question that he put in, he's at the library, so he can't talk. So he's saying, what is the viability of the universal basic income? He sees the potential benefits, but what about the necessity of lowering the purchasing power and problem of dependence it creates? For instance, in Canada, a UBI project was recently abruptly shuttered, and it caused a lot of grief for people not expecting to have to find a new way to pay for living expenses. Can UBI help with hard reach problems like child hunger? And I'll just note that I've been interested in that sort of question as well, and have been very interested in the framing of the question as universal basic assets rather than income, because it comes back to the point about ownership.
Could I just
so anybody who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd say it's universal basic economy. The asset issue, ownership issue, is old school. We're looking at what is the flow patterns that the individuals are involved in that make a community, the agency,
Mm-hmm.
and the networking. So, for instance, UBI in conventional money is a dead loss at so many levels, politically, functionally, consequently. You're using the old tool to do the same thing. So what we need is an economy where the support is embedded in the process and the systemic arrangements. Functionally, I think it's circular monies that are created by us in our communities. But that's an old preaching that I've been running for a few years. So I'm all for it, but not with the old tools. The old tools are a disaster. Move on.
And I'm sorry, Cameron, that we lost Bianca, who you aimed your question at, and Stephen, who has experience in the financial sector before this question came up. So I will make sure and ping them with the post to this for online furthering discussion. Gideon, did you want to talk about any of the questions?
Well, on the question of the UBI, I do think, for me, I think what's interesting about it is that I think it could introduce some economic stability that may be very helpful for where we're headed. But I think if we try to rely just solely on that, I think there are a lot of problems with it. One is, even just thinking about the increased power that gives to government, especially at a time like this, where that can be used as a tool to bring people under control, I think is disturbing. And I think that even more fundamentally, the reason that we work is not just about income, right? We work because we primarily, I think, for a lot of people, in terms of the thing that gets them up out of bed, if they like their job, is that they like their job. They like contributing. They like making a difference in the world. They like to have meaning. So UBI can help with that in the sense that it frees you to be able to do things that maybe you wouldn't normally be able to justify doing. So I think it's good in that sense. But I don't know if this is where you were going, Michael, but I like to see something more dynamic.
Well, quite entirely so. And
yeah.
In fact, the thing about a universal basic economy based upon community money is it not only enables people the latitude to give their time to things, it rewards them for giving their time to good things.
Mm-hmm.
You're acknowledging the gift in community. So that's the shift we need to make, is stop looking outside to the old umbilical cord. Start using the vitality of the organism itself.
Yeah.
So I'm totally in support with all the points you make, but coming from government, coming from the mandate, coming from the old machine, oh dear.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that's interesting about this, the reason when I think about ownership, I couple it with the idea of contributions. So
yeah.
That may be what you mean by flow, but
no. I actually mean flow. I mean that if we think in terms of what we have,
mm-hmm.
then our attitude towards flow is stuff comes in, stuff goes out. After that, it's not my department. Our sense of flow is egocentric to that ownership model. But what we need to look at is what our outflow, our giving of time, services, goods, our outflow of money, what consequences that has in this community as a whole. That pattern making is not just me, what's in it for me. Pattern making is how is my behavior relating to the greater commonwealth? And that means commonwealth currencies.
So I think the question, so that's what I'm interested in hearing more about is I mean, it's, you know, there is, you could say like a karma type, you know, there's lots of value that we create through our actions, not all of which are monetized, obviously. Right. So,
well, I want karma that buys me beer.
Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about is how do you do that? And the thing I think is interesting with some of these new models is, you know, that when I am participating in an enterprise, when I'm contributing to it, either social capital or with my time, I'm creating things and stuff like that, I get an equity stake in it. Now, you know, I find that really intriguing because I think it just opens things up. So that's when I am talking about kind of the concrete ways to get at some of this stuff, that's more what I'm looking at.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to sort of wind up here and stop the recording, have 5 minutes for reflection and what can go better next time. But thank you for coming. If you're watching, thank you for watching. You can become a member of the Digital Life Collective if you found value here, or donate on our site. And membership begins at $10 a year. And we're all volunteers at this point doing stuff that we find valuable, such as this panel discussion. Also, if you haven't seen it, the questions in the chat are very interesting, as well as the Q&A screen. So thank you, and we'll stop the recording.